I thought probably the best way to kick off is just a little bit about your background for people who don't know. Who's John Polson and your transition from your previous work life into owning a cycling clothing brand.
Um, I feel like I've lived a few lives, and excuse me, I'm in the back of Black Sheep, and there's going to be a few things that come in and out, so it might get a bit noisy. Um, yeah, so I mean, where do I start? I mean, once I left school, I went straight into uni, but I took a bit of an alternate path, I guess, to where like I am at the moment. So went straight into a Bachelor of Sports Science degree, and the plan was all along to go and study physiotherapy. Um, so I eventually went through and did physio, so 5 years of study with a master's. And at the same time, I was also competing as a professional triathlete, albeit, it's not where I was earning my living from. I was like, 99% of triathletes, maybe even less, they're doing it for the love of the sport rather than any economic gain. So I was doing both things, what was like a fairly difficult university degree or degrees, as well as trying to moonlight as a triathlete. That was originally short course triathlon, and then eventually went into long course later down the track. But once I finished physio, pretty much walked into my dream job. I've probably told this story a few times for those that know me and my story. Walked into my dream job on the Gold Coast sports practice that really kind of dealt with a large proportion of elite professional athletes on the Gold Coast. And I remember distinctly to this day, where I was, time of day. And I remember like just leaving the practice, just going, I can't believe I'm doing this for the rest of my life. Like I absolutely hated it. It was fucking terrible. Um, uh, and it didn't take long. I think I lasted 9 months. But for me, it was just feeling like to get into physiotherapy, you require quite a lot of intelligence. It's quite a high entrance score. So it's not giving myself a pat on the back. It's just by the nature of it is quite difficult to get into. So you are quite intelligent. You do leave university with quite a lot of knowledge. And then you kind of go into this career that kind of compartmentalizes you into, a fairly limited scope of practice. So that was like the distinct reason of that immediate, shock and awe of like, I can't believe I'm doing this for the rest of my life. And then not really struggling through those 9 months. And I don't mind saying this because my wife is also a physiotherapist, and she practices in a very different part as opposed to private practice physiotherapy. But so I left after 9 months, and basically got a job with one of my sponsors of mine, who was a clothing brand, and the rest is kind of history. Sorry for the clanking bottles in the background. Um, uh, and just loved it straight away. Like initially, my role was in charge of research and development for the clothing company, and every day was new, and could problem solve a lot, and obviously dealing with kind of a subset of people and a profession that I was generally quite interested in. And I could also do it while I was competing. So I was actually also working at that stage. I was based in Boulder, Colorado, for at least half of the year, and I could work over there. Use kind of NASCAR wind tunnels. And sorry, this is a very long-winded answer, so feel free to jump in. Um, and was loving it, and was probably there for 3 or 4 years. And really, Black Sheep started not through any real purposeful decision of mine. It was a bit of a creative outlet. Um, like a lot of businesses, there's strengths and positives, and one of the there's strengths and weaknesses. Sorry, and one of the weaknesses for me was that you could only like you didn't have full end-to-end control of how that product was released to market, and so I was creatively probably a little bit uninspired. Again, probably no through no fault of the business, but so initially I was just it was a bit of a creative outlet, and that was 2014. Um, and then, yeah, before you know it, you've got a business idea that then goes into business name registration and then starts an Instagram account. And then, boom, you kind of, it's obviously not that easy, but, back in 2014, it was kind of, the melting pot of organic social media. And, yeah, it just started from there. And that's how Black Sheep was born.
So with that change from obviously being a physio athlete, working in the fly clothing industry, where did you see Black Sheep being different? Like you talk about the creative outlet, like what was going to be the point of difference? Did you have a vision of what you saw Black Sheep as being, and what was it going to bring to cycling clothing compared to everything else that was out there?
Yeah. And I mean, not to kind of go over perhaps a story that many people have heard in different locations for different brands, because I think it's kind of that same time period where a lot of brands like us started. So like Map and Attacker were around that same year, and at that point only really Rafa was around, and they'd opened up this kind of ultra premium apparel side of the market. And so when you kind of forget about them for a second, really the only thing that was out there was Club Kit, or really shitty European brands, right? Or sorry, I should say really shitty styled European brands. So there wasn't too much out there. It was kind of face palm stuff of like, why is that on a kit? Why is that kind of styled and merchandised that way? Um, so it was really quite basic. Whereas you take the industry now, and it looks vastly different, and to create like a very unique selling point in your mind at the moment is a lot more difficult than it was back in 2014. Um, but at that point, it was really that, hey, like this sport is ripe for like bring it in line with whether you want to look at the tennis or running or just general fashion, surf culture. It's really ripe for the taking. And so, but I guess I wasn't looking at it from that kind of business mindset. It was really like, hey, like there's nothing really out there at the moment. And I'd love just, when I'm working in a business that, hey, we're producing a really good product, but it's just the same deal. It's just, it's not being finished the way that I genuinely think it could be. And also sold the way that I think it should be, like really kind of, um, you know, bringing out the emotion of the sport that cycling is so good at. People live and breathe, life on the bike. And the same applies to the product that's designed for it. You really want to have designers that live and breathe it and that understand the culture, that understand the athletes. And in the vast majority of the cases, and especially the business that I was working for, there just wasn't that understanding. So I guess that's where I was coming from. And it's like, hey, like from an end-to-end perspective, like there's a real opportunity here to like really embrace the culture of cycling, really understand what cyclists want. Um, and yeah, so that's how it started, and that was kind of my MO at the start.
I know floating around the cycling industry for a while myself, like the biggest thing that I noticed that when you guys hit the market was your storytelling. Was that something that you had from the start of, it's just not a cycling kit, it's, the lead up and that, the 2 to 3 week sort of marketing campaign sort of catching people's interest. Is that something
Yeah.
deliberate that you guys kicked off with?
Yeah, 100%. And that's ultimately like when the business was a business for sure. Whether you want to call it, a fear of missing out mentality or building a crescendo moment, or just generating a lot of hype. It was fairly unique back then. There's a lot more examples right now. Um, but it was also a bit of a byproduct of how the business was started. We never really had any seed in investment or access to a huge amount of capital, so our production runs at the start were very limited. So we were a limited release model by sheer
Yeah.
reality of how we were set up. So it was literally like, you've got to be quick to get this. And for the first few years, we pissed off a lot of customers because stuff sold out super quick, and it's the ideal circumstance, right? Of people want what they can't get. Um, so yeah, that was definitely part of it, and storytelling, like you were saying, that's always been my love. Telling stories, and I've always prioritized copywriting, and I'm quite an emotional person, but also that's reflected in a lot of my writing. And if I were to kind of backtrack or even fast forward through the last decade, where Black Sheep's been at its worst and when it's been at its best is, kind of correlating with, the priority of copywriting and the priority of storytelling. Because I think that then resonates through a lot of the other stuff within the business. It's, the emotion and the passion that you have for developing a product kind of, it all bleeds into it, right? That if people buy into the story and buy into the brand of exactly what you're doing or where you're going or, what you're planning to do, from staff through to your customers, they just, resonate with it so much more when there's like a really deep and authentic story there.
I know the first time I saw one of the black sheep kits was at a shop not too far from where you are, and a friend introduced and said, "Oh, check this out." I remember saying to him or asking him, "Yeah, where's the male kit?" It was a really unusual design, had something. It was probably out of the norm for the cycling industry. So, how do you see kit design in terms of aesthetics and the way they look, and also the manufacturing's changed since 2014, since you've been there? Because it has changed dramatically.
Yeah, there's probably a couple parts that I approach it. And again, it would be where I've seen Black Sheep at its best and at its worst. It's when it's, potentially followed these principles. But first and foremost, like from a branding perspective, is that ultimately the goal for me and for the brand is that people can recognize the product without necessarily seeing the logo. So that speaks to a few parts. Obviously, potentially a consistent style guide or aesthetic, but it's also product design. Kind of paneling. Those little kind of unique elements of a product or of a garment that is unique for that brand. And I think that's always got to be priority. And again, I would be self-critical in saying that Black Sheep has done this well and has also done this poorly as well. And when I look at our competitors and the competitors that do it well, it's nailing that first principle. And then secondly, it's probably more from a vanity and just general aesthetic perspective, as you alluded to. We were quite well known for doing quite out there graphics and out there styling. Very very purposeful from that respect. One of our first, definitely the first kind of light bulb moment, I guess, was a floral kit that we did, I think, on our second release, called the Floral Fin.
Yeah, I remember I
Uh,
bought that one.
yeah, and it just had flowers on it, right?
Yeah.
Uh, but I think there's flowers, and then there's also the color palette that goes on into those flowers, and I would say color palette is the most important element of that. And again, purely being self-critical, and as we scale as a business, kind of conveying those principles of color and color usage to your staff and to a growing team is kind of makes or breaks a business, and has been something that has definitely been a factor in our growth in terms of how well that has been kind of talked through amongst the team or set as a guiding principle amongst the team. So yeah, it's not just necessarily putting just out there patterns, whether those patterns are created internally at stage by me or whoever's working for the business, or something that we work with a local designer. It's not just a matter of just sticking a loud pattern on there. There's so much that goes into it that makes it wearable for that customer. So like you said, yes, at least at the start, like a lot of our designs were quite feminine, but you're trying to be on that threshold of being out there, but also at least being, actually, could I wear that? Or is that something I could wear? You don't want to go completely the other way. And it's like, fuck, that is just not something I would wear, even if I had a gun to my head. You obviously don't want to do that. Then you also don't want to be on the other end of the spectrum where it's like, oh, that's just looks like the same shit that everyone else does. And that's where color goes into it. It gives that kind of nice little kind of almost indecision by the customer if they're not necessarily someone that would wear florals. They're like, oh, but I really jive with that color palette. That's hugely important.
Looking where you now, like there's obviously a range of cuts coming into the market. 10, 15 years ago, it was pretty much there was one sort of shape and that was pretty much it. In terms of
Yeah.
where Black Sheep's going and probably a few of the brands, what do you see as the probably more important? Are you looking towards that elite, race cut, really specific sort of fabric for performance versus, the large majority of weekend warriors who want something that's comfortable, fits well, but aren't really worried about being a 15 kilogram climber.
Yeah, the way that I can best answer that is we are ultimately focused on the customer that lives and breathes the sport, right? So now we are not just cycling, we are also running. But I think the same principle applies that we are designing product, creating product for the athlete that lives and breathes cycling. We are designing running apparel for athletes that lives and breathes the sport of running. It's not to be confused with we are designing product for athletes that live and breathes both cycling and running. We're trying to be quite specific in terms of how we approach both sports. Um, so that's kind of the first step in answering that question. We are not trying to create product firstly for necessarily the new entrants, the people that are the transient people into cycling, or the ones that potentially, the weekend warriors that just do it once a week, that want a baggy jersey or just, whatever it is. But likewise, we don't also want the people that are just, elitist or, it, we obviously sponsor some elite professional teams, namely with ARA Skip Capital. But generally, we're not after the people that ride professionally. Firstly, that's a team sponsorship. But, the majority of those riders, don't buy their kit. But it's also it's a very, very kind of niche part of the market where they're 60 kilos dripping wet. It's very hard to kind of make a garment that would then also transcend into the general population. So the way that we frame it internally is the people that live and breathe the sport. So they're obviously quite lean, but it still comes in a variety of different body shapes. But there's an expectation that, at least from a cycling apparel perspective, that something would be, figure hugging, not necessarily loose, unless it's created for that, whether it's a tee or something like that. So that's kind of the best way. So we're not trying to be everything for everyone. We've narrowed that selection down. And it's kind of it's then sitting in this, like, I guess, the bell curve of cycling, where it's like this really enthusiast, sub-elite rider. And that's the rider that we're focused on. And ultimately that is where we're approaching it from a running perspective as well.
What do you reckon's been the biggest challenge not transitioning, but adding to the product line from cycling into running? Like obviously their functionality is different, the fabrics are different, they serve a different purpose.
Um, there's quite a few challenges, to be perfectly honest, and I think largely we've done it really well. But it's definitely, first and foremost, it's a communication issue. Is that you don't want to ostracize your cycling audience. Um, the reason why we went into it is primarily internally, right? Like, I'm a runner and always have been a runner. My affinity for running, stretches far further back than cycling, as it is for a lot of people, right? There's very minimal barriers to entering the sport of running. So if you are a runner from junior school, then that's obviously the life that you probably take. And so, especially, with Black Sheep growing and those sort of things, running was the sport that I kind of defaulted to from a time commitment perspective. And, I'm still quite ultra competitive, which is probably no surprise for anyone listening to this that knows me. Um, but it running gives me the ability to, compete by doing, 10 hours a week running versus if I was to do 10 hours a week cycling, then, it would be very difficult to compete off that, to get enough Ks. Um, so, but even if we've got this affinity internally for running and we're runners, obviously still, as I was suggesting, it's still a communication barrier that we have to get to our customers in terms of just making them understand that, hey, we are not, losing our focus off cycling. We are, essentially diversifying into this other category, but there are lifestyles, again, as I said before, of athletes that live and breathe the sport that they're doing, right? And I think that's ultimately, a great positioning for us in terms of becoming an endurance apparel brand, but much more focused on these, two fairly niche sports, but each with, requiring, a real understanding of what the athletes need, what they need during training, what they need during racing, durability components, seasonal components, those sort of things. So I think we're really well positioned because of our internal understanding of these athletes. There's a lot of people within Black Sheep that compete, that race in both sports, either individually or both of them. And it's no secret how much running is booming at the moment as well. So it's, I like to think that we're in a good position. It's still early days, but, just over a year into it. We're worn by the biggest running club in Australia. And it's definitely a category that's growing for us. So yeah, it is exciting, but it was quite a daunting decision to do.
Taking a bit of a change of tact. I know Black Sheep's been heavily involved with charity and good causes over the years. Man Right Always is a big one. From the first time a fantastic doco on men's mental health and things like. Obviously, it's a big investment, and not just financially, but time. Time from your staff and yourself. Like what brought that on, and it's been a continuing commitment by Black Sheep. Like, where's that come from?
Um, Definitely from myself. And Gilly, my story better than most. Black Sheep obviously wasn't started as a social give back business. It was pure kind of profit generating at the start because we had to do our next release. But we got to a point where we could give back. And I'm really proud. We've definitely batted above the size of a business for what we've contributed. But what instigated it was, for anyone owning a business, they would know how much it fucking sucks a lot of the time. I obviously own a business, as you do, Gilly, in a beautiful sport. Essentially on paper, like, what do we have to complain for? You ride a lot more than I do, but essentially, got no barriers to be outside. You're dealing with, fit people. You got a lot of travel opportunities, but the reality is it fucking sucks. A lot of the time, whether it's the financial side, whether it's, the leadership side, whether it is your own emotional side, and the latter is kind of where I'm probably going to head to answer the rest of this. It was just different components build on each other to create, quite a highly stressful environment. And I started Black Sheep when I was 26. So I was relatively young, and whilst I'd done a couple of degrees, very ill-equipped to manage, the stress of owning a business. And so ultimately, a lot of these lessons you've got to learn as you go. And so having gone through my experience as an athlete, having a little bit of anxiety as an athlete, it's an individual sport. It requires a lot of isolation, and you do become a bit of a head case, unfortunately. those same traits, as good as they are to help you build a business, do create, quite a lot of dark moments. And at least at the start, whilst I wasn't, suffering from, necessarily anything diagnosed as depression or even anxiety at that point, I could definitely feel and sympathize with how it was definitely a pathway to that happening. Um, and so in 2016, we did our first man ride for men's mental health. And it was very unapologetically about men's mental health. By that point, I'd also had experience with mates. Majority of them were former athletes, former triathletes that had been going through some rough patches themselves. Some experience with people taking their lives as well. So that was the impetus for that. Lo and behold, that my own personal experience would become a lot greater as I would, go on over the years. And kind of 3 or 4 years down the track, whether it's, business stress or just, let's say, just fatigue and the lack of resilience that perhaps you once had, with, when you're a little bit fresher or younger or more ignorant to some of this stuff, it definitely then developed into, diagnosed depression, diagnosed anxiety. Albeit I was still, at least from my perspective, quite highly functioning. But there were some really rough moments. 2020, start of COVID, through COVID, those sort of periods, like it's a roller coaster at the best of times. So I think, what it had started as, at least a respect for, developed into an experience of. And that's ultimately led me to this point of like, businesses will come and go, right? But, the importance of taking care of yourself, it sounds poetic, but taking care of yourself, taking care of others, um, taking care of your family, is just the most important things in life. Like the business doesn't matter. And if I, in some way, and it's still small, I'm proud of it. I think up until now, we've probably over 350 grand now that we've contributed in cash, and that's not nothing. But I think for me and for the team, it's knowing that we're doing something more than just making tight apparel for vain people like me. So yeah, that's ultimately where it is. So, and now it's not just mental health. It's so we've got 3 initiatives that back pretty much everything that we do. So it's the mental health component. It's the WMN initiative and the Future Project. The Future Project is all about creating a pathway for elite cyclists right from the junior ranks through under 23, and hopefully one day then riding for a professional pro tour team. And we've done quite a bit in that area, whether it's from our sponsorship of ARA Skip Capital right now, it's got a really beautiful story in itself with them just sponsoring but now they're a junior program that's a feeder team to a pro tour team. We've sponsored Inform and quite a few other teams in that respect. Under 23 Tour de France sponsor as well. So there's been quite a few aspects there where it's all just focused on creating impact in a lot of these younger cyclists' lives. So there's these 3 components, and they kind of then drive a lot of the stuff that we do from a commercial perspective. So whether it's releases or product development or those sort of things. So it gives ourselves like quite a nice set of guardrails where, again, we're not trying to be everything for everyone. We're not trying to support every single charity that comes through our door. And hopefully as a result, it gives us the ability to create a bigger impact.
Yeah, I know obviously a bit of involvement with the man ride, particularly over the last couple of years. It's always great to see the people at the end of the day and the experiences that people get. So it's a lot more than just sort of providing money to a charity. It's just those conversations and people looking forward again, like it's a yearly event, but people getting ready and prepared and looking for something a little different, something a little bit special about just, you know, other than just getting out and riding a bike. Um,
Yeah, for sure.
Looking towards, you know, 2025, as you said, owning a business, it never really stops and just keeps rolling, rolling and rolling. What is what's holding this year for Black Sheep 2025? Is it looking at new product or new designs? Is it expanding some of the range? What can people expect?
Yeah, I mean, 20 since COVID, we've definitely taken the approach like it's no surprise to anyone that the cycling industry has been kind of at the coalface of a lot of the economic movements of pre and post COVID world. So the cycling industry obviously went through a massive growth period during COVID as everyone, bought a bike because that was the only thing that they were basically able to do. And then post COVID, that kind of there's been a few things that have happened to the bike industry of that. Most notably, probably the wholesale industry, where those people that were buying all those bikes are obviously not going into store as much as they obviously were. So we spent the last couple of years navigating that change in demand, and it's mostly in the wholesale demand. E-commerce has always remained, very strong for us. So with 2025, it's we spent 2024 diversifying a little. As I said, it was probably to a point where it does make you feel a little bit uncomfortable because you're going outside of the customer that you've groomed and that have become very loyal to you, and at worst you've created some questions in their eyes. So it's 2025 is definitely a year of, I guess, consolidating internally. Um, you know, Bedding in those new products that have been released to the market, bedding in those principles of, making sure that customers know from a cycling perspective that, hey, that our priorities are very much there, as well. And likewise for running, making sure that, it's not seen as a flash in the pan. So a lot of the stuff that we're doing is just kind of leaning into the stuff that we'd introduced in 2024. Um, at the same time of like refining a few things. So, one of those things that we've got this kind of guiding principle, which might seem contradictory to what I was just saying, but a guiding principle for 2025 called Be Ballsy. Um, and it's just basically this drive of whether it's from a design perspective or whether it's from an event perspective of not being afraid to do stuff that makes us feel uncomfortable, but within reason. So we're not using Be Ballsy to like go, okay, we're just going to introduce all this product again. That's not it. But whether it's from, let's say from an event, we've got a few events coming up this year, both mid-year and end of the year, which, are quite significant events for us, both locally and a little bit further afield, that, perhaps in the last few years we would have not done. You'll see a few ballsy events this year. Design wise, also just taking that principle of like sometimes over the last few years, we've probably been a bit safe as we've grown, as we've tried to probably take on more customers and perhaps sometimes be everything to, too many people. Just go back and narrow our focus around, who exactly do we want to, what sets us apart. And so that's kind of it, a long-winded answer to like, it's consolidating from a product perspective on a lot of the stuff that we've done, but then at the same time, really understanding like what makes Black Sheep different, and from a design perspective, that's, being ballsy in our design. And from an event perspective, or a community perspective, it's doing those events that, other brands probably wouldn't do. So that probably gives you a little bit of a teaser in some of the stuff that we're going to do.
I know over the course of years, you're running, like from our perspective, we run cycling trips and we get to go to some great places, and it's always a challenge. I feel more like a logistics company than a cycling tour company.
Yeah.
Um, you're obviously hypercritical and you're always looking at, where you can improve, but occasionally there's days where you just go, you know what, I absolutely fucking nailed it. Like I know for us, we were in a day where we had 160 people. 5 different groups converged on one spot on a mountain at the Tour de France, and then to this day is one of the best days we've ever had at the tour. And in essence, it was like 3 weeks planning, a whole lot of people, a lot of moving parts, thinking outside of the box just to make it all happen, and it was all worth it. Looking back at, the history of Black Sheep, is there, one time or a garment or an event where you're going, you know what, this is exceeds what we ever hoped it to have achieved at the time? One where you've nailed
Yeah,
it.
it's a tough one for me to answer, and again, in fear that I do sound a little bit poetic or altruistic, it's genuinely something I've never been good at, and has actually been probably something that staff have picked up on as
That's the
something
reason
that
I'm
I need.
asking.
Yeah. Um, and to this day, it's something that I'm justly trying to improve of, like celebrating those wins. And that definitely stretches back to my life as an athlete. Like you're always chasing that next result, that next performance. That you never get a win or get a podium and go, fuck, I've made it, right? Um, it's at least for all the athletes, the elite athletes that I've met, that's never been a conversation that happens in their head. Yes, they celebrate for a short period of time, whether it's like shit, maybe the hour or a few hours post race, maybe maximum the next day. But by the time you're back training, right, you've forgotten it, and you're kind of just redlining it for the next result, trying to eke out the next 1%. And the same thing is applied for running Black Sheep. And I think that's why I didn't have that initial struggle with Black Sheep of that life after sport, because you're kind of applying exactly the same mentality as an athlete into owning a business. But it's definitely been the little kind of building block of why I've struggled with some of these things that I was alluding to before. Um, I think to answer your question, there's a few things, and most of the time it's outside of just, well, they're collection related, but it's when the collection is a lot more than just a collection. Um, the recent ones I can point to is we've now done three versions of our future project, um, and from my side they've been really beautiful collections, quite progressive in the way that they're styled. Um, been very successful, but also meant a lot more to us and also our customers. Again, the future project is funding things like ARA Skip Capital and those platforms. Um, and then midway last year we did our 10th anniversary collection, which is a little bit more of a kind of a self-involved release, but it meant a lot. It's celebrated, perhaps to what we're talking about. It celebrated, the previous 10 years of what is all the amazing stuff that we did, and that again was very successful. But it was a story that was a lot more than just the product itself. So there are probably a couple of things that would jump in my mind, but I think that's actually a good thing, right? Like I think there's the component of, okay, like it's not like I give myself a slap on the back all the time and walk through the office like I'm a fucking king. I'd never want to be that person, nor do I gravitate to those sort of people as friends or and employees. So I think that understated mentality is good, and I do like that. But it's definitely something as a team or as a leader, is that making sure that staff and the wider team are able to celebrate and give themselves a pat on the back when they've done something well. And it creates this, like at the very least, it stops them that mentality of going from one thing to the next, where it's really a never ending quest, because that's just burnout. I've burnt out about 1,000 times over the last 10 years. And you've got no choice but to just truck on. But for staff, that's, they have other choices than just to burn out. Like they can go to a different place to work, and or they can choose not to do as good an effort if they're burnt out. So it is vital that they do celebrate. But in the same token, and And I think this is also where the power of it will hopefully be as well, is that they can also then be critical when, they haven't done as good as what they, expect of themselves. And I think that's, at least from my perspective, that is a great kind of aspect for them, or realm for them to be in. It's like this entrepreneurial mindset of not always accepting substandard results, but the only way that you're going to do that is ensuring that they're appreciating when they've done a good job.
Great. Johnny, thanks for, you know, putting up with me. I've been hassling you about this for a while now, so I was pleasantly surprised when you finally agreed to the email heading was, I need a favor and I know you're going to hate this. So it's been great. I'm forever peppering you for different things. So I appreciate you taking the time and sharing your story. Like I've had the privilege of sort of looking from afar and sticking my head in the door every now and then and seeing everything that's going on. But I think it's a great story to be able to tell. And I know from my side and for all the bikes like clients, it's good to be able to see our relationships we have with, the whole cycling community, that we're sort of in this sport, and relationships are important for us in the industry.
No, not at all. I mean, I've said it a few times to you, Gilly, but seeing what you did during COVID, not just professionally, but what you went through professionally, but also personally, it will be something that I remember for the rest of my life. In terms of the selflessness that you displayed, and I will forever be in your debt. For the support that you provided to me even during that time as well. So, what you've done with Bike Style is obviously a testament to you, but it's, I think, for anyone that's been on a tour with you, or has got to know you and is lucky enough to call you a friend, will know just how selfless you are for everyone. So whenever I can reply to an email, and I'm the world's worst replying to emails, and do something like this, I will always do it.
Thanks, buddy. Much appreciated.